The last guest at the Midnight Motel. Hi, I'm your host. Welcome to the Nameless host. Settle in, make yourself comfortable, help yourself to anything you want from the mini bar. Oh, and don't forget to like and subscribe before you check out. The first time I ever stayed at the Midnight Motel was when I was 21. I'd just finished my first year of university, and I was heading back home for the summer holidays. Now my parents live 3 hours away, and it's not exactly a long journey. But since I had so much stuff with me, I tidied that I would stop halfway at the nearest motel, and then continue the rest of the way the next day. It was around midnight when I got there, so I didn't even bother calling ahead to book. I just turned the car around and headed to the only open room on the only floor that they had. Now, the place looked absolutely fine. The staff were lovely. They let me have an early check-in, and they showed me to my room, which was located right at the end of the corridor. Now, I was tired, and all I wanted to do was get to my room and go to sleep, so I barely paid any attention to the interior. I walked through the door, I set my bags down, I stripped off my clothes, and I went straight to bed. Now, I must have been exhausted, because I slept like a log. I woke up in the middle of the night, and I could hear someone outside of my window, and at first, I couldn't figure out what the sound was. It sounded like someone pacing back and forth right outside of my window. My room was on the ground floor, but the window was really high up, so I knew whoever was outside wouldn't be able to get in if they tried. Still, I couldn't help but worry about what was going on. I thought maybe it was some sort of animal, but it didn't sound like any kind of animal that I've ever heard before. I thought it might be a dog, but it didn't sound like a dog. Thought maybe it was a cat, but it didn't sound like a cat. Whatever it was, it sounded big and heavy, and it was definitely walking on 2 legs. I can't describe the sound to you. I've never heard anything like it before or since. Now, this went on for a few minutes, and then suddenly I heard glass shattering. Clean. This must have come from somewhere outside of my room, and immediately after, I heard screaming. The woman screamed, and she screamed, and she screamed, but her voice didn't match up with the size of the creature. She sounded tiny and frail, like an old woman. Whatever was making those sounds outside of my window was massive and strong. Then everything went quiet again. The footsteps stopped, and the creature, or whatever it was, it moved away from my window, and I could hear it moving down the corridor. I could hear it getting closer and closer to my door. I could hear it stop right outside of my door, then start to move away once again. I listened intently, but now it was too quiet to hear anything. So I closed my eyes, pulled the covers over my head, and tried to go back to sleep. When I woke up again, the sun was shining in through my window, and the sound of birds could be heard tweeting in the trees. Soon as I heard this, I shot out of bed and ran to my window. I flung it open and I looked down onto the car park below. That's when I noticed something strange. There were no cars in the car park, and there were no other buildings anywhere to be seen. I felt a sudden sense of dread wash over me. I stepped back from the window and I started to look around the room. That's when I noticed more things that seemed odd. There were no curtains on the windows. The bed sheets on the bed were yellowed and stained. The carpet on the floor had what looked like blood stains all over it. And the air in the room felt thick and stale. And suddenly it hit me. This was no ordinary motel. I was in the middle of nowhere, and there was no one else around. I was completely alone. I ran to the door and I threw it open. I needed to find someone, anyone who worked there. Maybe I'd run into another guest if I needed to get out of there. I ran to the end of the corridor, but I realized that every single room along the way was empty. All of them were vacant. Then I made my way back to my room, and as I approached my room, I noticed something that sent shivers down my spine. Right outside of my room was the shattered remains of the window from next door. Now, when I'd looked out of my window in the morning, it had been intact, and now it was broken. So that meant that whatever was out there was still out there. Something was still lurking outside of my room. My heart began to race, and my breathing started to become more shallow. Fear began to consume me. I was trapped in a room with a monster. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the window, but eventually I managed to drag my eyes away from it. I was terrified to move, terrified to turn my back on the window, but I had to get out of there. I had to find somebody. So I made my way out of the room and I started to explore the motel. I checked everywhere. I called out for help. But nobody answered. All the rooms were empty and the place was deserted. I remember standing in the middle of the motel, looking around at the empty rooms. And I remember thinking, how is it possible that every single guest in this hotel has vanished? At this point, I was panicking. I needed to get out of there. I ran back to my car and I started to drive. I drove until I saw another building, a house with lights on, and people outside playing in the garden. I stopped and asked them where I was and what town I was near. And that's when I realized I wasn't close to where I thought I was. I was much further away than I thought I would be. But I kept driving, and eventually I found myself back on the road heading towards my parents' house. Throughout the whole journey, I didn't stop to eat, drink, or use the toilet. I just kept driving. I had to get home. I had to tell someone what happened. When I finally arrived at my parents' house, I was shaking. I burst through the front door and I told them everything. Of course, they didn't believe me. I sounded crazy. How could I possibly expect anyone to believe me? It's been alone in a room with a monster that nobody else could see. So I just went to bed and hoped that everything would seem more clear in the morning. But when I woke up the next day, my fear hadn't vanished. In fact, it had only grown stronger. I was still scared that whatever was in that room was still out there somewhere. And I was scared that no one would believe me if I told them what I'd experienced. So I contacted the police and I told them what happened. Of course, they didn't believe me either. How could they? I was talking about a monster that didn't exist. But then I told them that I was willing to show them where I'd been staying. So they took me back to the motel. But when we arrived, it was gone. In its place was a brand new shopping mall. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this terrifying tale and you're still craving some spine-chilling stories, don't worry. I've got plenty of other thrilling content lined up for you, so stay tuned for more surprises coming your way. So, get ready for a little surprise. There's something special waiting for you after the credits roll. Just after I hung up the phone with the police officer, I saw a little girl in a Victorian nightgown walking towards me from the motel room that I'd been staying in. She was holding a teddy bear in her arms, and as she walked, she hummed a lullaby. She walked past me, and she continued to walk further down the corridor. I followed her, but she disappeared.